Hey class, I hope everyone's doing well. Ready for another week of New Testament 2. Today we're going to be looking at the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So our format for the lecture is going to be similar to previous ones. We're going to look at the authorship dating, look at who wrote the book, when the book was written, look at some of the themes of the book, some hermeneutical issues, um, and then go over an outline of the book as well. And so those will be the format, the theme for this lecture today. And so again, it'll be through First, Second, and Third John. All three books are in one PowerPoint, which you can download and follow along with. So, jumping into First John, we're starting in on slide number 2, and we're going to discuss some authorship. What we have for the book in terms of authorship for First John is not a lot of certainty, if you will. So what we do know is that the early church fathers attributed it to John the Apostle, which is also the same John who wrote the fourth gospel. And what we know about Second John was that it was linked to First John by the end of the 2nd century, and we see Origen grouping First, Second, and Third John together. That's kind of when we see all three of these books kind of put together with the title of John. And so what we do know is that the author of First John was an eyewitness to Jesus' life and ministry. We get that from the opening. It doesn't say his name is John, but based on that, based on what verses 1 through 4 says, indicates he was an eyewitness. It says, that which was that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard we proclaim, also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete. And so from these 4 verses, we see that whoever this author is, he was an eyewitness. Especially verse 3, which we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you. And so, and there are a lot of similarities between First John and the fourth gospel. So, in terms of themes, vocabulary, sentence structure, those kinds of things, a lot of similarities between First John and the Gospel of John. So, most people, most scholars seem to indicate and think that it was John the Apostle, the author of the fourth gospel, who wrote this book as well. And so, it doesn't say, I, John the Apostle, wrote this or anything like that, but based on its grouping with Second John, based on Origen, grouping them together as well, based on church tradition and history, based on sentence structure and similarities, those kinds of things, leads us to think that it was written by that same John the Apostle. In terms of dating, it's dependent on when the fourth gospel is written. The traditional date for the fourth gospel is in the 80s. And what we do know, based on church tradition, was that he moved to Ephesus before the destruction of the temple, and he stayed there until his death. And so that's about as much as we can piece together in terms of when this book was written. Moving on to slide 3, we do have purpose and themes of this book. So really the purpose of this book was written to show differences between true believers and false teachers. So the purpose is writing to show the differences between true believers and false teachers. And he does this through 3 tests. And so this is kind of the theme that we see in this book. 3 different tests that he puts forth. And so one is a righteousness test. The second is a love test. And the third is a belief test. And so what we're going to see is that John is giving a series of tests, and those who fail these tests are proven to be the false teacher. So he's saying, look, if you want to know who a false teacher is, look at these qualities, look at these characteristics. If you see someone who matches up with this, whose teaching is this, then they are a false teacher. And so, beginning with the righteousness test, we see that in chapter 1, verses 6 through 10 is where we first see that. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, it says, "If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us." And so he's saying here is that we have fellowship with him if we walk in the light. If we walk in the light. So you see someone doing righteous deeds, then that is the person who is at fellowship with God. We also see in chapter 2, verses 3 through 6, another element of this righteousness test. It says, "And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." And so, again, we see this test here that, look, someone who belongs to God is someone who's going to live righteously. And so, and from this, we learn that, assurance of our salvation doesn't come by saying a prayer. If you're walking in darkness, you can't know your assurance. You can't know for sure. He says, if we keep his commandments, that is the way in which we can know for sure, or that's the way we can know with some assurance that you're genuinely saved. So we see here that assurance isn't based on, what you say, but it's based on what does your life look like. And so really, in this, it's not about perfection. It's not about perfection, because if it was, he wouldn't say, ye have sinned, that we sin. But it's about a position of our lives. It says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And so it's not so much, this test isn't so much about being perfect. It's about the position of our lives. And so, is this person striving to fight sin? Are they, identifying something as sin? Are they, seeking to put it to death, to fight it, to put it into it? So, within this first test to determine if someone is genuinely a believer or if they're a false teacher, we can look at their life. If their life isn't one of righteousness, if they're not striving for and pursuing and making progress in righteousness, then they're not a believer, or they're most likely a false teacher. The second test that we see is the love test. The love test, and we see this in two sections in chapter 2. And so we see in verses 9 through 11, and they read, "Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes." And so you cannot be in the light and hate your brother. So again, if your life is characterized by hate, if you have a genuine hate for someone in your life, then you're not a believer. You would be identifying as a false teacher. You cannot be in the light and hate your brother. And then also verses 15 through 17. It says this, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, and the desires of the eyes, and the pride of possessions, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." And so in this section, you see that you cannot love the world and claim to love the Father. So in this love test, what he's getting at is that a true Christian loves others. You can't say that my faith is between me and God. You can't do that because your faith forces us to love others, okay? It forces us to love and serve others, okay? And so, again, with that, Conversely, then, if you do love the world, then you don't love the Father. And so, again, look at someone's life. What is characterizing their life? Is it a righteous life? Is it a life characterized by right love, by correct love? Are they loving their neighbor, and are they loving God, or are they loving the world? Which one? And so, and then thirdly, we see the belief test, and we see that in chapter 2 again as well. We see it in chapter 2, verses 22 through 23. It says this: "Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also." And so, again, in terms of the belief test, those who deny the Son are antichrists. Okay, those who deny the Son are antichrist. So, a true Christian believes that Jesus has come in the flesh. John Stott would call this a doctrinal test. For the love test, John Stott would also call this maybe the social test. And so, again, in order to see the difference between a believer and a false teacher, what do they say about Jesus? Anyone denying the Son is an antichrist, is a false teacher. And so, excuse me. So that theme of false teachers and kind of that push and discussion, if you will, of false teachers is continued as well. And again, that's a major theme of this book. So we know that false teachers, they denied that Jesus came bodily. We can see that in chapter 2, verse 22, and also chapter 4, verses 2 through 3, where it says, "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already." So the false teachers, they denied that Jesus came in bodily form, and there was also a proto-Gnosticism to them. So the Gnostic heresy came after the first century, but things were present in the first century that did lead to that did build up to that. And so one of those is a dualism. So that's saying that matter, the physical world, the material world is evil, and that the spiritual world or the immaterial is good. So that's dualism, that the material is evil and that the immaterial is good. Docetism was also floating around during this time as well in the first century. And remember, Docetism is that Christ simply appeared to be human. He merely seemed human. He wasn't actually human. He just seemed that way. That's Docetism. Docetism, excuse me. And then Cerinthianism was also floating around as well. And so Jesus, and that kind of idea is that Jesus only became Christ at baptism and it left him at the cross. Therefore, Jesus, the man, is not the Christ. And so that's what Cerinthianism is. And so that those are things and ideas being spread within the first century that these false teachers most likely were espousing. And so that's why First John here puts so clearly, blatantly and clearly, what you have to believe about Jesus, what you have to believe about the Son. And so if you deny him, then you're a false teacher. And so if you deny him, if you deny him properly, then you are a false teacher. And so, again, if you say that Jesus came but he wasn't really human, or if he was only Christ part of the time, or anything like that, then that's not believing in the biblical Jesus. That's not believing in the Jesus according to the scriptures. And so therefore that is false teaching. And so, continuing on to the fifth slide, there are some hermeneutical issues in this book I would like us to take a look at. And so the first of that comes in 1 John chapter 5 in verse 6, where it says, "This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not by the water only, but by the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one who testifies, because the Spirit is the truth." Excuse me. And so with this, historically the church has kind of tried to understand what is meant by water and blood, that he who came by water and blood. And so there's the Catholic interpretation, which says that he is referring to the sacraments here. Um, if your view and understanding is that that these two things refer to the sacraments, then the question that you have to pose is, how does that counter the false teaching claims? How does that symbolism relate to him coming in a completed historical event? What about the body and the bread? Um, so is that so only half of the Lord's Supper is really kind of uh, present here. It does speak of the blood, but what about the body and the bread? And so again, that's kind of the Catholic interpretation of this verse. That's in reference to um, the sacraments, but that idea, that understanding, doesn't really fit in with the overall purpose of the book. And if you did want to go with that, then you have to, again, answer these questions. How does it fit into the purpose? And then what about the rest of the Eucharist? Why is only the blood listed here and not the body that was also broken? It's only half of the Lord's Supper. And then another view, another understanding is that it refers to John 19:34 and 35. John chapter 19:34 and 35. And so that passage says this. John 19:34 and 35. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may also believe. And so, if you say that this passage then refers to that passage, again, the question is posed: does this do anything against the false teachers? Um, in a sense, yes. Because if blood and water came out, then it does show that he was human. But there are some problems with this, though, with this understanding. First of all, that's a different order of words. It just is blood and water versus water and blood. Secondly, it says he came by water and blood, not the water and blood flowing out of him is how Jesus came. And then thirdly, not only did water come out, but water and blood. And so, again, to say that refers to those two verses does present its own problems. Then a third interpretation, understanding of this passage, which is the more common view, is that it refers to Jesus' baptism, not the sacrament of baptism, but his very own baptism, the very own completed event of his baptism. And then the blood then is referring to his crucifixion. And this argument seems to fit the criteria and the purpose of the book, in addressing the false teachers and the false teaching going on about Jesus. And so, it makes the most sense of that. And so, again, I can't say it's really, both ordinances because it leaves out part. But if you say it's referring to the blood of his crucifixion, and it refers to his baptism, then that seems to fit best the purpose of the book. Again, that being to fight false teachers, being able to identify true believers by their belief. And then another verse that has historically caused some problems is chapter 5 and verse 16. It says, "If anyone sees his brother committing a sin not leading to death, he shall ask, and God will give him life to those who commit sins that do not lead to death." There is sin that leads to death. I do not say that one should pray for that. I do not say that one should pray for that. And so, what is this sin that leads to death? And can you sin and not die? What is going on here? What is that passage? What is this verse referring to? And so, looking at the context of this book and the purpose of the letter, one would say that it's referring more to just the physical death. And really kind of the best guess, the best kind of understanding of this verse is that would be fitting in and referring to the sin of apostasy, believing that Jesus did not come in the flesh, and that is denying God's Messiah. And so that would probably and most likely be what it's referring to, would be the sin of apostasy. Moving on to slide 6, this is going to be a question I'm posing on the discussion board. I want to see how you would interpret this and explain this verse. Little children, keep yourself from idols. It's the very last verse of 1 John, and I would like for you to elaborate and explain on that. And so I would like for you to reply to that on the discussion board. So moving on to slide 7, you'll see our outline of 1 John. And so we see that we have the prologue, so the introduction, the first 4 verses, and then we have this first cycle of tests. And again, this book is kind of made up of these cycles of tests. So the first cycle is chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 2, verse 27. And again, we see the test of righteousness, the test of love, and the test of belief. And so we already read through those verses. Then we see the second cycle of tests in chapter 2, verse 28 through chapter 4 and through verse 6. And again, it's the same. A test of righteousness, a test of love, and a test of belief. And then we have this third cycle as well, chapter 4, verse 7 through chapter 5, verse 21. Where we see, again, a test of love, a test of belief, and a test of righteousness. So if you want to know the difference between a false teacher and a true believer, look at these things. Look at these things and how they live. And then you'll be able to tell that. So moving on to the book of 2 John. It's definitely a short book, but in terms of the authorship and audience, in terms of the author, all we have is the elder. It says the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the faith. Again, what we have, the best thing that we have to go off on is tradition, and church tradition says that John the apostle wrote this, and he wrote it to the chosen lady and her children. So in terms of figuring out who that is and what that is, there's 2 obvious choices. There is a literal female believer and her children, or there's the metaphorical. It could be metaphorical of the church and its members. Verses 8, 10, and 12 are plural. We see there. Verse 13, it says, the children of your elect sister greet you. So it could be possibly referring to another church and its members. Its cryptic language was used if they were in danger of persecution. So cryptic language would be used in times of persecution. So that might lend credence. That might be a metaphorical reference there. And so again, we're not 100% sure if it's written to a female believer or if it's written to a church. I personally lean more towards it being a church and its members, but we don't know that for sure and for certain. But what appears to be the purpose of this book is that it warns against traveling preachers, as some are deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. And for those, it says, do not let them in your house. I would say that's not personally don't let them in the house, but as a church, don't let them in. Do not let false teachers into your congregation. Just don't admit them. And so some themes that we see is to walk in truth and to reject false teachers. We see walking in truth in the first 6 verses. The elder to the elect lady of her children, whom I love, and the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace be with us all, from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing to you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk in according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from him in the beginning, so that you should walk in it. And then we have the rest of the book, which is rejecting false teachers, verses 7 through 11. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch yourselves, so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. And so, if you were to help the false teacher, then you would be contributing to the spreading of the heresy and the false lies. And so, that would definitely be our purpose and theme. And so, moving on to slide 9. We have our outline here, and the introduction is the first 3 verses. The body is composed of verses 4 through 11, the walk in truth section of verses 4 through 6, and then the reject false teachers of verses 7 through 11, and then conclusion 12 and 13 say, though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and walk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister greet you. And so, moving on to 3 John, we see that a church tradition also puts this as being John the Apostle. Again, I don't know that for sure, but church tradition would have John the Apostle as the author, and it was sent to Gaius, whom he loves in truth. And so, the purpose of this book is to warn against following Diotrephes, and encourages to follow him after Demetrius. And so again, as similarly to 1st and 2nd John, the theme for 3rd John is to walk in the truth and to receive true teachers. And so where as 2nd John was reject false teachers, this is to receive true teachers. And so it's similar to 2nd John in the sense that both stress the idea of truth, both speak of hospitality, both mention the author's intent to visit and to mention the author's intent to visit, and it mentions he has more to say. And so we see that comparing 2nd John chapter 12 with 3rd John verses 13 and 14. And so in terms of recipients, it says that it was written to Gaius in verse 1, and John sent out representatives who have reported to Gaius's faithfulness to provide hospitality to itinerant preachers. We see that in verses 5 through 8. Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like this, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. And so in terms of the purpose of the book, it's to thank Gaius for receiving the traveling preachers, to warn them about the activities of Diotrephes, and who loves to be first in verses 9 and 10, and it encourages him to follow the example of Demetrius in verses 11 and 12. Again, the theme is to walk in the truth and to receive, as provide hospitality for true teachers. And so slide 11 is the outline for this book. We have the introduction in verse 1. The body is composed in verses 2 through 12. And in that we see the commendation of Gaius in verses 2 through 8, the criticism of Diotrephes in verses 9 and 10, and the commendation of Demetrius in verses 11 and 12, and then the conclusion in verses 13 through 15. Where again it says, I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, every one of them. And so that concludes our lecture on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John today. Hope you all have a blessed week, and take care.